Okay, let's talk about preventing heat impaired performance. Again, that's our bias, is that we're interested in exercise in hot environments. Running a marathon in hot weather is very difficult. That's why the New York Marathon is in November. That's why the Boston Marathon is in April. Those are cooler temperatures. Even the Las Vegas Marathon used to be in December. It's in November now. Maybe moving to February next year. We'll see. But it's going to be in a cool temperature. And there's some advantages to having cool temperatures. Not cold, but cool. We also know pre-cooling of active muscles prolongs endurance time to exhaustion. That keeps core temperature low. Elevated core temperature leads to exhaustion. That's the key. That's the focus that we're having in discussing the material in this chapter. Or cooling of blood to the brain. You're trying to keep the blood cooler as it goes to the hypothalamus even. All right. So preventing heat impaired performance, there's some different mechanisms, some different strategies. Well, sponging the body does seem to be effective. You have to lower core temperature though. And if you can lower core temperature, excuse me, if you can lower skin temperature, then core temperature heat will be drawn away from the core and will move towards the skin. So sponge the body. And we know this in Las Vegas. We know if we even get out of a pool and we stand there, we know how quickly the water whisks off us. That evaporation actually does help cool the skin as well. So we want to have water on the skin when we are in hot environments and let the heat move that water off the skin. Before exercises, it's important to know that humans cannot store fluid to any great extent. Yes, you can retain water, but you're not really storing fluid like camels do. Camels can store up to 30% of their body weight. Humans cannot exercise if they are dehydrated more than 10%. We've gone through that before. And deaths can occur at 20% body weight loss. Okay, so those are big numbers. Those are big numbers. Calculate 10% of your weight. That's a big number. That's a lot of loss of fluid. The goal of pre-exercise drinking is simply to ensure appropriate levels of hydration at the start of exercise. Over-drinking simply leads to more frequent bathroom breaks and potentially leading to a loss of sodium. So we want to be careful of not over-drinking before an event. Monitoring hydration really comes down to a level of urine color. You just need the color to be very lightly colored. It does take about 1 to 2 hours for fluid to be fully absorbed and to ultimately influence urine color. So a suggestion for race day is to drink up to 2 hours before the race and then about 400 to 500 milliliters of fluid as close to a start. That's a small water bottle or half of a liter of water. Now, what's interesting is there has been a huge change in perspective on fluid intake during exercise. Okay, a huge change. And Noakes does a really nice job of going through some of the history here. And he brings up a couple of examples of fluid, ingesting fluid from a historical perspective. Joseph Forshaw in 1908, an Olympic marathon, stated, "I know from actual experience that the full race can be covered in credible time without so much as a single drop of water being taken or even sponging the head." Wow. Okay, and Jim Peters, elite marathon runner, there's no need to take any solid food at all, and every effort should also be made to do without liquid. As the moment of food or drink is taken, the body has to start dealing with its digestion, and in so doing, some discomfort will almost invariably be felt. Geez, that's not like our commercials nowadays, are they? I mean, these two runners, elite runners, and others like them, very much were not promoting drinking during marathons. Now we go to a marathon and we have aid stations probably every mile, maybe every 2 miles, depending on the course. So there is fluid as well as solid food available throughout the duration of the race. So very different experience now versus back in the 60s or 50s running. Current recommendations, these may be a little dated still, but ACSM, 150 to 300 milliliters every 15 minutes. That works out to about 600 to 1200 milliliters per hour. That's a lot. That's about a liter. All right, but we do need to figure out how much we are losing in sweat rate. Rate of fluid ingestion should match sweat rate is one time the recommendation stated. Runners are encouraged to consume the maximum amount that can be tolerated. Well, Noakes does a really nice job of challenging pretty much any hydration strategy, looking for the evidence to support it. And the evidence is pretty scarce. It's not, a lot of it's anecdotal, not necessarily empirical. And so we got to be careful with some of these recommendations, and we'd be a little bit more objective in our decisions in how much to drink. So what changed? Well, there was a research that reported body temperatures increased in runners who became dehydrated more than 3% their body weight. Runners took in about 100 milliliters of fluid, and the conclusion was dehydration is detrimental to endurance performance. But Noakes raises a challenge. There are several parameters that change as body temperature increases. The intensity of exercise, furthermore, is an important factor that influences body temperature. So the people who are running the fastest, they have the greatest potential to generate more heat. Here's some data on that. Post-race rectal temperature. Rectal temperature is the same as core temperature and percent water deficit. And there's some runners there. And the race winners are identified in the open circles. They had the highest core temperatures after the race. And some of the highest percentage of water deficit after the race. All right, that's really important. So two interpretations. One would be these runners should have taken in fluid to not have lost 4 to 5% of their weight. But the other interpretation is to be a top endurance athlete, you need to be able to tolerate levels of dehydration, or you need to be able to tolerate elevation of core temperature in order to be a top level athlete. If you can't tolerate either of those, you're going to stop exercising or you're going to slow down. Here's some data from the South African Ironman triathlon back in 2000 and 2001. 2000 are top in 2001 in the bottom two plots. The first one is percentage change in body weight, and then the actual change in body weight, so in kilograms. So 2.2 pounds per kilogram. So 5 kilograms is about a little over 10, 11 pounds. Right? And the negative sign meaning a loss at the end of the race of about 10, 11 pounds. That's not uncommon. Lots of people are finishing the Ironman in South Africa with a loss of maybe a couple of pounds to as much as 10, maybe 12 pounds. And that works out to these percentages. This is 2000, this is 2001. And same thing, change in body weight and percent change in body weight. In 2001, some people finished the race the same weight they started. Most people finished at a weight lower than what they started. So it doesn't always work out that people are following whatever guidelines are out there for hydration. So during exercise, high body temperature leads to detrimental endurance performance. That's the key with this chapter and the material that we're going over. You want to minimize the influence of core temperature. Now, yes, I did just state that to be a high-level athlete, maybe you need to tolerate high levels of core temperature. That may be the case, right? But for the rest of us, mere mortals, we're trying to sustain core temperature. Ingesting fluid during exercise is a strategy. It's a mechanism to help maintain body temperature. And every time you drink something during a race, That's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to maintain homeostasis. You're trying to maintain core temperature. So the question becomes, how much do you take in? Do we take in as much as we sweat out? So is ingestion equal to sweat rate? Well, for each liter of unreplaced fluid, there is a rise in core temperature by about 0.3 degrees Celsius. Heart rate will increase by 8 beats per minute, and cardiac output decreases by about 1 liter per minute. And that's primarily through a decrease in stroke volume. We do need to be careful of looking at research in the laboratory versus a competitive event. They are different. Laboratory obviously is more controlled. The competitive environment provides a better motivation for exercising at a higher intensity. So we just need to be careful when we're interpreting both laboratory and competitive experimental models. Finishing body weight are higher than athletes who do not drink as much. Does the extra body weight have a detrimental effect on performance? So when body weight is higher at the end than versus much lower, did we overdrink? Did you just simply take in more weight that you need to carry to complete a marathon? And really, how much loss in weight is dehydration? We've got to be careful when we when we weigh ourselves in the beginning of exercise, we weigh again at the end of exercise. A portion of the weight will be the loss of metabolic weight, so fats and carbohydrates. You use those for fuel, that weighs something. Same thing, if you weigh your car before a trip to San Diego, and then you drive and your gas tank is about 3/4 or half full, then the difference in weight is because you've used that fuel, not because of any other reason. Well, same thing in the human body, our fats weigh something, our carbohydrates weigh something. So if we end up with a body weight that's maintained at the end of a race or exercise session, then we probably are overhydrated during that event or exercise session. Now, it is important to calculate sweat rate, and I highly encourage you to figure out your sweat rate. You have to do this often. You have to do it at different times of years in different environments. You need to know your weight before exercise. You need to know your weight after exercise. You need to know any fluid intake during exercise and any other fluid loss, like going to the bathroom. That should actually be in this equation too. And then you need to know your running time in hours, or your cycling time, or even swim time. All those, you have the potential to lose weight. And then you just put those parameters into this equation. You add in the fluid that you take in. So if you drink a bottle, you have to account for that. And then you get a sweat rate and sweat of liters per hour. Right? 1 pound of water is about half a liter. Okay, just as a heads up. You can correct the equation on page 208 to add in the fluid that you take in during exercise. So let's look at sweat rate for different sized athletes. Here we have sweat rate here on this axis here, and this axis here for a 100-kilogram athlete and a 50-kilogram athlete. Sweat rates will be influenced by size of athlete. Okay. And this smaller athlete, this is the energy used. Let me do this. This is the energy used during used during exercise. This is the heat generated, and the difference here is represented as transformation of energy from chemical to mechanical. That's your 30% efficiency. So this is your energy used to propel yourself forward. Smaller athlete needs less energy to move yourself forward than a bigger athlete for a given running speed. Sorry, I should have said that. This is running speed on the x-axis. So determining how much to drink is partly dependent on how much a person sweats. It's not correct to recommend a specific amount of fluid to take in during exercise, bottom line. A 50-kilogram athlete is going to be different than a 100-kilogram athlete. Men are going to be different than women. Fit athletes are going to be different than unfit athletes. Older athletes are going to be different than younger athletes. We've got to be really careful about recommending a specific amount of fluid. Now, when we are talking about getting fluid in, it is a challenge to drink 600 milliliters of fluid per hour during running. It's not easy. You get these little cups, and you've got to squish the cup in a way to be able to drink it while you're running, or you have to slow down, you have to walk, maybe stop, which can happen in an Ironman, but you mostly want to try to keep moving forward and drink on the run. That's not easy. So getting fluid in on the run is hard. Getting fluid in on the bike is a little easier. You don't have that sloshing going on during running. You can also measure it a lot easier because you're not spilling it as much, because you have water bottles that you have, Camelback, easy to keep track of the amount of water that you're drinking on the bike. And a lot of Ironman athletes will focus in really on the hydration plan for the bike. And then the run, they try to take in fluid ad libitum as best they can whenever they want to or can take fluid in. All right, during running, you probably get about 200 milliliters of water at an aid station, one. For a marathon, there can be lots of different aid stations. For other events, maybe not so much, maybe halfway through the event. Now, Noakes has suggested, and I've mentioned this before, drinking ad libitum at will may be sufficient. But I and others encourage people to have a fluid intake plan pre-race. Have a strategy, have a sense, and practice that strategy well before the event. There is some evidence that runners may benefit from swishing water and spitting it out. I've talked about that before in other presentations. This is the swish and spit concept, and that can be with carbohydrate. It could be with water, but typically with carbohydrate, if you swish it in your mouth and spit it back out, you can still have a performance benefit. This can actually become a factor in an Ironman race. Is at the end, if you feel you cannot tolerate taking anything in, I encourage people, and I've done it myself, to at least put some carbohydrate in your mouth and then spit it back out. And maybe you can trick yourself into running a bit more. Anecdotal evidence right there. So this idea of doing a swish and spit and seeing a performance benefit, that is evidence supporting a central governor model. Race tip, have a plan. Have a hydration strategy. Regular fluid fuel intake during the bike leg is critical. That's the easiest way to do it. And then run, you try to do best you can. And obviously on the swim, you can't take it in because you're swimming. Plan for the aid stations. Know the course, know what's offered, know where the aid stations are, know how much you need to carry yourself, know when you need to have bottles empty in order to replace them, what food may be available, all of that. That's all course recon, all figuring it out. And you try to figure out how different fluids taste based upon temperature, because a lot of times when you're handled a bottle like this person right here, this bottle may have been sitting outside for 6 hours in the heat. So it's not going to taste as good as pulling out of my fridge where it's nice and cool, or if I add ice into it. So you do need to taste these, one, during exercise, but then two, during the type of temperature that you may be drinking it during the event. Okay, hyponatremia. This is another big part of this chapter, and you need to know what hyponatremia is. Hyponatremia is a decreased concentration of sodium in the blood. How do you get a decreased concentration of sodium in the blood? Well, you drink too much. And you drink too much of a fluid that does not have sodium or enough sodium in it. And that excessive fluid intake can happen before and during exercise. Now, what's interesting is the hyponatremia is not due to excessive sodium loss. It's due to an overhydration problem. Hyponatremia is more dangerous than dehydration. Hyponatremia can lead to death. Right? Hyponatremia can lead to death. I started teaching this class about 10 years ago. And at that time, very few people knew anything about hyponatremia. It's become a bigger problem, and fortunately, the medical community and race directors and med tents have a better understanding of hyponatremia and what to do and how do I detect it for races nowadays. It's a problem more so for the non-elite runners who are running at slower speeds. Why would that be? Well, the slower the speed that an athlete's going, the more opportunity there is to drink at aid stations. They can walk to an aid station, they can drink, walk to the next aid station, drink, whereas a higher performing athlete would be working at a higher intensity, have a greater sweat rate, and they won't have the opportunity to overdrink. And so this is a problem. And one time I was at an event and talking with a med tent director and looking at athletes coming in. I said, hey, how do you know if this person's dehydrated or if they're hyponatremic? And he said, you know, at the time that these folks are coming in, I'm thinking dehydration because it was the 8 to 10 hour mark. But he said somewhere around the 10 to 12 hour mark and longer, then I'm thinking hyponatremia when someone comes in, because the symptoms are very similar for hyponatremia and dehydration, just the way that you present in a confused fashion. All right, so NOx, this is really important. The reason why athletes drink too much is almost certainly due to the hysteria attached to the supposed dangers that dehydration poses to an athlete and the benefit that fatigue is caused by, and the belief that fatigue is caused by dehydration. So that replacing more fluid than is lost during exercise will ensure optimum performance. I find no scientific support for either belief. And this is why even in this presentation and previous ones, I've emphasized the issue with exercise in the heat is maintaining core temperature, not dehydration. You need to drink to maintain core temperature. You're not as worried about dehydration. If you're dehydrated, you're most likely going to slow down and stop exercising. The problem that has happened with marketing is more people will drink more and more thinking that they need to prevent any loss of fluid in the body and in order to stave off fatigue. But that's not the case. You're trying to simply allow a sweat mechanism to occur. You're simply trying to maintain core temperature. Okay, ingesting a fluid, certain things will influence how well the fluid is absorbed into the body. Osmolality is the characteristic of a solution determined by how much of dissolved substances are in the solution. Obviously, if you have water, that we're not dealing with osmolality, but it's when you start adding in carbohydrate, when you start adding in electrolytes into the water, that's going to increase the osmolality. For sports drinks, osmolality increases with adding carbohydrate, protein, and electrolytes. We can have a hypertonic drink, high osmolality. That delays gastric emptying. That delays the fluid from leaving the stomach and going into the small intestines and then into the large intestines, where you're going to have absorption of carbohydrate in the small intestines and fluid in the large intestines. An isotonic drink, the osmolality is normal. It does not negatively influence gastric emptying. A hypotonic drink, low osmolality, increases gastric emptying. So water is actually a low osmolality drink. When plasma osmolality increases above normal, kidneys are prevented from losing water in order to decrease plasma osmolality. So the kidneys are very critical in maintaining proper hydration status for the athlete. Increases in plasma osmolality also stimulates thirst, stimulates taking in water, which reduces osmolality. And this is why Noakes advocates an ad libitum approach to hydration, is that he has a sense that people will sense when they need to drink and maintain homeostasis. That being said, exercising in the hot environments like Las Vegas, you can get a very dry mouth. And so sometimes you're trying to take in fluid just to get rid of that dry mouth feeling. All right. But we've got to be careful about osmolality and what type of substances are in a drink, and that will influence gastric emptying. The electrolyte content in a fluid, it would seem reasonable to match the electrolyte lost in sweat. This continues to be a contentious point. There are advocates in the field for taking in salt, for example, during exercise, and there's people who say salt doesn't matter. You have plenty of salt in your diet. So it's a very confusing world right now, and the best answer I can give is the athlete needs to figure out if they can tolerate electrolytes during an event, and if that helps in performance at all. Electrolytes are chemical substances that are vital to the normal function of cells: sodium, potassium, magnesium, chloride. Most sport drinks have about 20 millimoles of sodium per liter. Noakes argues that this is an inadequate amount, and the sodium should be as high as 60 millimoles of sodium per liter. The problem is when you start adding that much sodium into a drink, taste gets really sort of odd, and it actually is a problem. But this is often why aid stations will have things like chicken broth or pretzels, especially in ultra endurance events, or during an Ironman event. The aid stations will bring the chicken broth out as the sun goes down. And it's not anything to do with the sun. It has to do with the length of time people have been on the course at that point. And at that point, people may have been exercising for 12, 13 hours. And that may be a time that they need some more sodium. So sodium is this funny world right now. You probably need some, but our diets probably have a lot of salt in them already, and we may already be adequate with the amount of sodium. So best advice I can give is you need to figure it out individually, how much sodium you need and how much you can tolerate. Carbohydrate and fat content of fluid influences the ingestion of the fluid as well as the absorption of the fluid. These are factors that influence gastric emptying rate. As I said, you want to get the fluid out of the stomach into the small intestines for carbohydrates and fats to be absorbed, then into large intestines so water can be absorbed. Accelerating factors: large ingested volume and so big bolus of water or big bolus of a drink. Isotonic solutions, as talked about, fluids, cold fluids, cold foods and beverages, low fat protein content, running at a slower intensity, and a calm mental atmosphere. These things will all influence the absorption rate or gastric emptying. Decelerating factor, the small ingested volume, hypertonic solutions, hot fluids, and so forth. Factors that have no effect: probably training, rest, and water and hypotonic solutions may not influence it one way or the other. Okay, this graph is important. Figure 411. It's the effects of exercise intensity, fluid temperature, glucose concentration, and ingested volume on the rate of gastric emptying. All right, and then these arrows represent some different drinks. So here's intensity of exercise, percent VO2 max. Rate of gastric emptying gets less as intensity goes down. Okay, gets less as intensity, gastric emptying goes down as intensity goes up. Rate of gastric emptying goes down as the fluid temperature that you're trying to drink goes up. Okay, as fluid temperature goes up, gastric emptying goes down. As glucose concentration goes up, gastric emptying goes down. And here's some typical drinks. As volume ingested goes up, gastric emptying goes up. So this is an important issue to know when you're reading literature on hydration, is how did the research protocol deliver whatever fluid is being studied. So for example, if after you do your exercise, if you take one big drink of a liter at one point in the exercise session, you may get a different response for your study than if you took 4 marginally large drinks and you spread that liter out over an hour over 4 different drinking points. Because your rate of gastric emptying is going to be influenced by how much you just drank. The key is during an event, probably the best thing to think about is you want to maintain a certain level of volume in the stomach to allow for consistent emptying of the gastric area, GI area, over the long course of the race. So factors that influence gastric emptying: intensity of exercise, glucose concentration, fluid temperature, and volume ingested. Just a summary of what I just said. Remember, the data are based on drinking one time versus repeated drinking, or we've just got to be able to separate out those types of studies. With repeated drinking, the stomach remains distended at full, and higher rates of gastric emptying can be achieved. Differences in gastric emptying rates can be minimized by repeated drinking. So that's a good race tip. Drink consistently. Maintain a certain volume in the stomach. The most important factor determining gastric emptying, in fact, is the volume of solution in the stomach, not the carbohydrate content. So you want to drink enough to maintain gastric volume, but not overdrink and be at a risk of hyponatremia. Most runners are not at a risk of hyponatremia, but those consuming more than 1 liter per hour for long periods of time are. 1 liter per hour sounds like a lot. Here in the desert, it's actually not. Sweat rates can be 1.5 to 2 liters per hour here in Las Vegas during the summer. So you have to account for that with your hydration strategy. So we just need to be really careful with, again, absolute numbers. You need to figure out your sweat rate, or an athlete needs to figure out their sweat rate to be able to take in the right amount of fluid over an endurance event. Fluid ingestion during recovery: increasing the sodium content of the fluid during recovery increases rates of rehydration, so that's good. Drink should have about 25 millimoles per liter of sodium. 25 millimoles of sodium per liter. Volume should be about 20 to 50% of the total fluid deficit. So you want to drink pretty soon afterwards. Now, I talked about acclimatization for Kona using saunas. That's a time actually that you would not drink right after getting out of the sauna, and that you are actually trying to promote a certain level of dehydration in order to stimulate an acclimatization to the hot environment. So it's a little tricky at times trying to figure out exactly what you're doing post-race, but have a plan. If you're trying to recover to be able to exercise again the next day, drink afterwards. What's the ideal sports drink? Oh, goodness, there's no single one. But some general recommendations: carbohydrate content is good. Usually, carbohydrate type, avoid fructose, and sodium content about 60 millimoles per liter. This being said, there is some contemporary thinking that you want to have your hydration plan consist of water, and your carbohydrate come from a different source, not from a drink. And the reason why people are moving in this direction, athletes that is that they may be able to sustain a better hydration plan and a better fueling plan if they do this. Sometimes by combining the carbohydrate and the hydration, you can either consume you may consume the wrong amount of fluid for the wrong environment. You may need a certain amount of fluid that for a particular course, and that may be independent of the amount of carbohydrate you need. So there is a movement to separate these two things out. And so what some people actually do is they take one water bottle, make it a highly concentrated water bottle of carbohydrate. And then all their other water bottles or anything they pick up from an aid station is water. And then they'll take a sip of that highly concentrated drink and then add water by drinking other water. This is just sort of a schematic from a company where you can make your own drink by changing the flavor from strong to weak, the amount of carbohydrate, calories, the electrolyte blend, protein. So there's lots of different options for even creating your own drink. And you can make your own drink as well. You can even change the flavor. Interestingly, flavor may actually play a role with hydration. Bottom line is you need something that's palatable. It's no good if you can't drink it. It's no good. Carbohydrate concentration, probably 5 to 10%, but what can be tolerated? Higher concentrations may be more appropriate near the end of a race where an athlete does not want to drink anymore, but they may need to get some carbohydrate in. The type of carbohydrate, a mixture of carbohydrate sources may be good. That would increase palatability, staying away from fructose, and sodium concentration, 20 to 60 millimoles per liter. Summary, ingesting of fluid during an exercise, you're trying to, most of this chapter was focused on maintaining core temperature. Drinking carbohydrate is obviously going back to the previous chapter and making sure that you have appropriate fuel and you're staving off liver glycogen depletion. We talked about factors that influence gastric emptying, the critical factor being the volume in the stomach. And then we talked about hyponatremia, which can happen when you overdrink over long periods of time. And this is more dangerous than dehydration. Okay, thank you.